My name is Charlie, and for years, my parents saw me as the quiet workhorse, the reliable one they could afford to sacrifice. They thought they could declare me an incompetent addict, pack me away to some facility, and drain every cent of my hard-earned savings to save my older sister from a federal indictment. But here's the detail they overlooked. You cannot trap an auditor with fake paperwork. 3 months ago, I walked into a family courtroom and watched my mother, Brenda, drop to the floor, fainting right after a federal judge looked at the evidence I provided and ordered the bailiff to place my father in handcuffs. When the judge asked where my supposedly missing $80,000 really went, and I opened my red binder, my mother lost the ability to breathe. But to understand how we got there, let me take you back to that cold Tuesday evening when they cornered me in my own home. It was November in Anchorage, Alaska. The wind carried the scent of freezing rain and aviation fuel, a smell that always clung to my work parka. I pushed open the front door of my apartment, expecting the familiar quiet of my own space. Instead, the air inside tasted thick. The cloying sweetness of my mother's gardenia perfume clashed with the stale heat radiating from the baseboard vents. I stopped on the welcome mat. My living room had been rearranged into a stage. My mother, Brenda, sat right in the center of the gray sofa, clutching a crumpled tissue. My father, Richard, stood near the frost-rimmed window, arms crossed, playing the stern patriarch. Tucked into the armchair sat my older sister, Jessica, in a pristine cashmere sweater that looked like it had just stepped off a first-class flight. And standing near the coat rack was a man I didn't recognize, wearing a beige cardigan and holding a silver clipboard. At his feet sat a rigid black suitcase. It was not my suitcase. The door clicked shut behind me. Nobody moved to hug me. Nobody said hello. "Charlie, where is the $80? Zero that disappeared from your savings this month?" my father asked, his tone carrying the practiced cadence of a reasonable man dealing with an unstable employee. I didn't take off my coat. I stood there, letting the freezing cold drip from my boots onto the hardwood floor. I ran a quick visual audit of the room, 4 people blocking the main exits, a packed bag, a stranger holding documents. The weight distribution was asymmetrical. The payload was a lie. For a brief moment, my mind flashed to the $80,000. It was my life savings, earned by working double shifts during dark Alaskan winters, coordinating freight runs through brutal weather systems. 3 weeks prior, I'd noticed a strange digital ping on my primary checking account, a tiny verification charge from a bank in Seattle. I hadn't called my parents. I had quietly moved every cent I owned into a protected forensic trust. I changed my passwords. I locked my credit. I did what an auditor does. I secured the cargo. They didn't know that. They only knew the money was suddenly out of their reach. "We know about the pills, Charlie," Brenda spoke up, her voice wavering perfectly on cue. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes, careful not to smudge her expensive mascara. "The secret addiction, you are destroying yourself. We just want our daughter back." I stared at her. I hadn't taken so much as a single ibuprofen since a dental crown procedure 3 years ago. I worked in an aviation industry subject to random federal drug testing. My system was cleaner than the snow outside. But logic has no place in a theatrical performance. Denial is the most common symptom of the disease. The stranger in the cardigan stepped forward, offering a warm, sympathetic smile. "I am Dr. Evans. Your family hired me to facilitate this transition. There is a bed waiting for you at a dual diagnosis facility in Oregon. The transport van is idling down the street." Jessica leaned forward, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "Please. Charlie, we flew all the way up here because we love you. Just let us help you." They were waiting for a reaction. They wanted tears. They wanted shouting. They wanted a frantic, defensive outburst they could point toward as undeniable proof of my mental instability. Instead, I unbuttoned my collar and let the silence stretch out. The heater ticked in the corner, measuring the seconds. I looked at Jessica. Her luxury boutique in Seattle was supposedly thriving. Yet, she flew to Anchorage on a random Tuesday to stage an intervention for an addiction she knew I did not possess. "The $80,000, Dr. Evans prompted again, tapping his pen against the clipboard. An addict's finances always tell the true story. You drained your own high-yield savings account 3 weeks ago. The money is gone. Where did it go, Charlie? He stepped closer and slid a stapled document across the glass coffee table. This is a standard medical intake form. Sign the front page, and we walk out to the van quietly. Your parents are prepared to assume temporary power of attorney to pay your bills and maintain your apartment while you recover. Pay my bills, maintain my apartment. The puzzle pieces began to slide into their designated slots. I didn't answer his question about the money. I walked slowly toward the table, keeping my breathing even, and picked up the packet. The top page requested emergency medical authorization to transport me across state lines. I noted the date. The facility header, the blank line meant for my initials. Then, guided by a habit born of auditing thousands of flight logs, I flipped to page 2. My chest tightened, but I kept my facial muscles entirely slack. At the bottom of the second sheet, resting neatly on the authorization line, was my signature. It was an exquisite forgery, mimicking the sharp, specific loops I used on banking documents. The notary seal beside it carried a date from 2 weeks ago. They did not come to my apartment to secure my consent. They came to stage a crisis. They needed the neighbors to hear me shout. They needed a supposed medical professional to witness my breaking point. So the paperwork they had already falsified would hold up under legal scrutiny. If I reacted with anger, they won. If I threw them out, they would note my erratic behavior in their fake medical file. They thought they had cornered an exhausted logistics coordinator. They did not realize they had cornered someone who spent her entire life studying how structures collapse. I stood holding the clipboard, letting my eyes trace the deliberate curves of the forged signature on the second page. The ink was a crisp dark blue. Someone had practiced this. My mind, trained in the meticulous world of aviation logistics, began to calculate the vectors of their deception. I had to play this perfectly. I had to let them believe they were winning. I need a moment to think, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. This is a lot to process. My father exchanged a triumphant glance with my mother. Dr. Evans offered a patronizing nod. Of course, Charlie, we understand this is difficult. We're here to help you. I retreated to my bedroom, ostensibly to pack, but in reality, to execute the first phase of my counteroffensive. I pulled out my laptop, connected to a secure VPN, and began to work. I had already moved my money, but now I needed to secure my digital life and lay the groundwork for their downfall. I sent a series of encrypted messages to my attorney, Harrison Vance, a man who understood the intricacies of federal law as well as I understood weight distribution. I explained the situation, the forged documents, the false accusations, and most importantly, the true location of my $80,000. I also gave him the green light to activate the federal whistleblower reports I had pre-filed weeks ago. They thought they had trapped me. They had merely activated a meticulously planned counter-strategy. When I emerged from my room with a small overnight bag, I was calm. Too calm, perhaps. Dr. Evans looked slightly unnerved. "Are you ready, Charlie?" "As I'll ever be," I replied. Offering a small, unsettling smile, I walked past them, out the door, and into the waiting transport van. I let them believe they had won the first round, but the game had only just begun. The next few weeks were a blur of legal preparations. Harrison Vance was a force of nature, a legal strategist who saw the courtroom as a chessboard. He understood that my parents' plan hinged on portraying me as an unstable addict, and that their forged documents were their primary weapon. Our strategy was simple, yet terrifyingly precise. Let them commit to their lies under oath, then dismantle their entire fabrication with irrefutable evidence. One afternoon, Vance called me into his office. He had located Dr. Evans. The color ghosted across his face. "Your parents made a critical logistical error, Charlie," he said, turning the monitor so I could view the screen. It was a flashy commercial site advertising holistic life coaching and alternative wellness interventions. The photograph on the landing page featured the man in the beige cardigan smiling warmly. His name was listed as Julian Evans. "He holds no medical degree," Vance stated, pulling up a secondary database. He is not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a licensed clinical social worker. He is an unlicensed life coach operating a gray market intervention business. Furthermore, he has a documented history of civil litigation. 3 years ago, he was sued for insurance fraud after submitting falsified billing claims to a private health network. The revelation hit the room, shifting the entire weight distribution of the impending courtroom battle. My parents needed a medical authority to legitimize their ambush, because no actual doctor would sign a forced intake form without examining the patient. They bypassed the medical establishment entirely. They paid a disgraced life coach to play the role, hoping his confident demeanor and forged paperwork would slip past a busy family court judge. "We have our wedge," Vance said, his voice gaining a sharp, aggressive edge. "If we present this red binder to the judge initially, they will dismiss it as the paranoid ramblings of an addict. We must wait for your parents to commit to their lie on the public record. We will let them present their fake doctor and their forged documents. Once they swear under penalty of perjury that their evidence is authentic, we will introduce Mr. Julian Evans to the reality of criminal cross-examination." The strategy was risky. It required me to sit in a courtroom and silently absorb their defamation while waiting for the precise moment to detonate the evidence. But logistics is the science of calculated risks. I knew how to hold my nerve during extreme turbulence. Vance drafted a series of expedited subpoenas directing his paralegal to serve Julian Evans immediately. We spent the remainder of the afternoon rehearsing the procedural flow of the hearing. I left his office as the winter sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete architecture of downtown Anchorage. I drove back to my apartment, my phone still buzzing with toxic messages from relatives convinced I was a monster. They believed the narrative my sister spun on social media. They believed the glossy illusion. They did not understand that the illusion was about to shatter, and the shrapnel was going to hit everyone standing in the blast radius. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the quiet, dark hallway. The physical preparation was complete, but the federal leverage still required activation. I needed to ensure that when the family court deception collapsed, the federal trap snapped shut simultaneously. I carried my laptop to the dining table and prepared to drop a very specific match into a highly volatile powder keg. I sat at the dining table, illuminated only by the blue light of my laptop screen. Harrison Vance was preparing the local legal defense, but I needed to secure the federal flank. My parents operated under the assumption that a frozen checking account rendered me powerless. They equated liquid cash with operational capability. They failed to realize that in the modern era, data is the ultimate currency. I connected my computer to a high-capacity laser printer I kept in the spare bedroom. For the next 48 hours, that machine did not stop humming. I did not sleep. I consumed black coffee and arranged the documents with the exact same focus I used when balancing a freight load destined for a remote Arctic village. I built the counter manifest. It was a 400-page master ledger documenting every structural fracture in their fraudulent architecture. I did not simply print spreadsheets. I formatted the information using the strict protocols of an aviation safety audit. Section 1 contained the corporate registration filings for Apex Luxuria Holdings, cross-referenced against my stolen social security number. Section 2 displayed the raw network metadata, tracing the fraudulent document submissions directly to the unencrypted wireless router at Jessica's Seattle storefront. Section 3 mapped the forged power of attorney, utilizing the digital purchase receipts tracing the notary seal back to Richard's credit card and his suburban Anchorage Internet Protocol address. I slid each printed page into a heavy-duty transparent sleeve, snapping them into 3 thick red binders. The smell of warm toner and synthetic plastic filled the apartment, replacing the lingering scent of my mother's perfume from the night of the ambush. The physical binders were destined for the family court judge, but the digital equivalents required a different destination. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to the official reporting portals for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Crimes Unit. Filing a federal whistleblower report is a precise mechanical process. The forms demanded categorical precision. You do not write emotional paragraphs about family betrayal. You input dates, dollar amounts, routing numbers, and definitive proof of wire fraud. I answered every prompt with numerical facts. I uploaded the digital network logs. I attached the forged commercial lease agreements. I provided the offshore vendor coordinates Jessica used to wash the borrowed capital under the guise of importing European fashion. The federal agencies would now have everything they needed to launch a full-scale investigation into Jessica's boutique and, by extension, my parents' complicity. The courtroom was a sterile, impersonal space. A stark contrast to the emotional chaos my family had manufactured. My parents and Jessica sat on one side, a picture of strained composure. Julian Evans, in a different beige cardigan, looked less confident now that his subpoena had arrived. I sat beside Harrison Vance, my red binders stacked neatly before me, a silent testament to the months of meticulous work. My parents' lawyer began, painting a picture of a concerned family desperate to save their daughter from a devastating addiction. My mother dabbed at her eyes, my father nodded gravely, and Jessica offered a performance of tearful concern. Julian Evans, the doctor, took the stand, testifying to my supposed erratic behavior and the necessity of immediate intervention. He presented the forged medical intake forms, swearing under oath that my signature was authentic. The judge listened patiently. Occasionally glancing at me, I remained impassive, a blank slate, just as Vance had instructed. It was agonizing to hear their lies, to feel the weight of their betrayal, but I held my nerve. I remembered the collapsing structures, the unbalanced loads, the precise calculations required to prevent disaster. This was no different. Then it was Vance's turn. He approached Julian Evans. "Dr. Evans," he began, his voice calm. "You testified that you are a medical professional and that Ms. Smith willingly signed these documents. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Evans replied, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "And you are aware that lying under oath, especially in a federal court, carries severe penalties, including imprisonment." "I am," Evans said, his voice a little less steady. Vance then produced the commercial website for Julian Evans, Holistic Life Coach. He displayed the screen for the judge and for everyone in the courtroom to see. "Dr. Evans, can you explain why your professional website makes no mention of a medical degree, a psychology license, or any affiliation with a recognized medical institution?" The color drained from Evans's face. He stammered, I provide alternative wellness solutions." "Indeed," Vance continued, then produced the civil litigation records. "And can you also explain why you were sued 3 years ago for insurance fraud, specifically for submitting falsified billing claims to a private health network?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's face contorted in a mixture of anger and panic. Jessica looked utterly bewildered. "Your Honor," Vance addressed the judge, "we have here a man who is not a doctor, who has a history of fraud, and who has just committed perjury by testifying under oath about his medical qualifications and the authenticity of a forged document. This entire intervention, Your Honor, is a sham designed to illegally seize Ms. Smith's assets." Then, it was my turn. Vance called me to the stand. He asked me about the $80,000. I explained how I had moved it into a forensic trust after noticing the suspicious activity. I explained my work, my meticulous nature, my understanding of fraud. Then, Vance presented my red binders. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady, "these binders contain a 400-page audit of my parents' and sisters' financial activities. They detail the fraudulent corporate registrations, the network metadata tracing the forged documents to my sister's Seattle storefront, and the digital purchase receipts for the notary seal used on the forged power of attorney, traced back to my father's credit card." I watched as my mother's eyes widened, then rolled back in her head as she collapsed. The hollow thud of her designer purse hitting the hardwood floor was the only sound in the stunned courtroom. The judge, a stern woman who had seen it all, looked at the evidence, then at my father. Mr. Smith, she said, her voice cutting through the silence, based on the compelling evidence presented, I find sufficient grounds to believe that you and your wife have engaged in identity theft, forgery, and attempted financial exploitation. Bailiff, place Mr. Smith in handcuffs. The federal trap, activated days earlier, snapped shut simultaneously. As my father was led away, I knew that the IRS and FBI would be moving in on Jessica's boutique. My parents, in their misguided attempt to save their golden child, had engineered not only my sister's destruction, but their own. My parents didn't set out to become villains. They arrived at that courtroom through 1,000 small compromises. A slow erosion of honesty and fairness that began long before Jessica ever opened her boutique. Parenting, at its core, requires a profound level of emotional awareness. It demands the ability to see our children not as extensions of our own egos, but as autonomous individuals who require equitable guidance. The tragedy of my family is a masterclass in the dangers of the golden child and the scapegoat dynamic. In traditional family structures, there is often an unspoken expectation that the strong must silently sacrifice for the weak. I was hypercompetent, stoic, and reliable. Jessica was charismatic, fragile, and dependent. Instead of fostering resilience in Jessica and celebrating my independence, my parents weaponized my competence to subsidize Jessica's illusion. This is where the moral compass of a family shatters. True parental responsibility is not about shielding a child from the consequences of their actions. When Richard and Brenda discovered Jessica was drowning in federal tax liens and operating a wire fraud scheme, their parental duty was to guide her toward accountability. Accountability is the highest, most difficult form of love. It requires a parent to stand beside a child as they face the fire they ignited. Instead, Richard and Brenda chose enablement. They confused protection with pathology. They decided that preserving the image of their successful daughter was worth sacrificing the freedom, finances, and sanity of their reliable daughter. They justified identity theft and forged medical records under the guise of saving the family. But a family built on a foundation of deception is just a ghost ship waiting for a storm. By lacking the emotional courage to tell Jessica no, they ultimately engineered her destruction, handing her over to a federal indictment on a silver platter. There is a vital lesson here about long-term guidance for the next generation. We must teach our children that honesty is not just a moral luxury. It is an operational necessity. When we raise children in an environment where fairness is compromised, where the rules apply to one sibling but not the other, we breed resentment and structural instability. Children learn their values by observing how power and resources are distributed at the dinner table. If they see that manipulation yields reward, while silent hard work yields only heavier burdens, the familial bond rots from the inside out. My ultimate victory was not just surviving the courtroom trap, it was breaking the generational cycle of exploitation. I took the $80,000, the very asset my parents tried to steal, and transformed it into a foundation for others by opening a financial literacy initiative for young women in Juneau. I redefined what long-term guidance looks like in modern American culture. I am teaching the next generation the skills my parents failed to teach Jessica: how to read a ledger, how to recognize a predatory signature, and how to draw an unreachable boundary. I am teaching young women that they do not have to be the invisible shock absorbers for people who refuse to carry their own weight. This story asks us to look deeply at our own definition of loyalty. In many traditional structures, we are taught that family is an unbreakable bond, that blood dictates an infinite tolerance for pain. But I learned that biological relation does not grant a license for abuse. You can love your family while simultaneously locking the door and changing the deadbolt. You can honor your roots while refusing to be buried by them. If this reflection struck a chord with you, if you have ever found yourself quietly carrying the weight of a structure someone else unbalanced, you are not alone. There is a community of people who understand the quiet strength it takes to audit your own life and step away from the wreckage. We invite you to join us. Follow and subscribe to Aura Vengeance, where we continue to explore stories of resilience, the exposure of loud deceptions, and the quiet power of undeniable truth. As you step away from this story, take a moment to look at the architecture of your own life. Look at the relationships that demand your energy, your time, and your silence. Every structure has a breaking point, and every relationship has a ledger. When the heavy winter storms eventually roll in and the pressure on the roof begins to mount, who is truly holding up the walls in your home? And more importantly, if the walls ever began to crack, would they sacrifice you to keep the ceiling from falling?